Slate Creek Valley, Montana Territory, October 1891. While his neighbors prepared for winter in the usual way, stockpiling cord after cord of firewood, chinkling gaps with moss and clay, laying in extra blankets, Jacob Winter was doing something they'd never seen before. The old Norwegian hunter was rebuilding his hearth. Not repairing it, rebuilding it entirely. And the design made absolutely no sense. "He's lost his mind," muttered Samuel Bradley, the settlement's most experienced mason, watching from across the creek. 30 years I've built fireplaces. That angle will never draw." What Bradley and the others saw defied every principle of frontier construction they knew. Vinter's firebox slanted backward at what appeared to be a dangerous pitch. The chimney sat offset, wrong, they said, and he was packing the walls with far more stone than any hearth needed. For 1,000 pounds of river rock and sandstone, by some estimates. The entire structure extended 18 inches deeper into the cabin walls than standard practice allowed. Waste of stone. Waste of time, Bradley declared to anyone who'd listen. Come January, he'll freeze like the rest of us. Probably worse, with that crooked chimney. But Winter, 73 years old, weathered and quiet, just kept working. He'd survived 47 Norwegian winters before crossing the Atlantic. He'd spent 26 years in these Montana mountains, hunting elk and bear in conditions that killed younger men. And he was building something the valley had never seen, something his grandfather had taught him in a country where winter lasted 8 months and firewood was precious as gold. The question no one was asking: what did this old hunter understand about thermal mass and heat retention that even experienced builders missed? Before we reveal what happened when the deadly cold arrived, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And I promise you'll learn a heating technique that could save you a fortune if you ever build off-grid. Now let's see why they called him crazy. The mockery began the moment Winter laid the first foundation stones. Traditional hearths of the 1890s followed a simple logic. Build the firebox square, run the chimney straight up, use enough stone to contain the fire but not so much that it wasted labor. Keep the air fast, keep the flames hot, burn through the night. That was the wisdom. That was what worked. Winter's design violated every rule. First, the angle. His firebox tilted back at 43 degrees, so steep that logs would roll toward the rear wall instead of sitting flat. "The fire will choke itself," Bradley warned. "Smoke will pour into the cabin." But Winter had calculated that pitch exactly. The rear wall, built from dense river sandstone, would catch the direct flame while allowing just enough draft to pull smoke upward through the offset flue. Second, the mass. Where a standard hearth might use 1,200 pounds of stone, Winter mortared in more than 4,000. The back and side walls extended 22 inches thick. He selected stones not for appearance, but for density and heat capacity. River-tumbled sandstone, granite, limestone. He rejected shale and slate entirely. Too brittle when heated. He explained to his wife in Norwegian. They crack. They don't hold. Third, the configuration. The firebox sat lower than usual, only 9 inches off the cabin floor, and the stone structure wrapped around 3 sides of the fire in a U shape, extending 18 inches into the log walls on either side. To observers, it looked like he was walling himself off from his own heat source. "You're building a prison for your fire, old man," called out Thomas Hendricks, a younger trapper who'd built 3 cabins in the valley. "That much stone will suck up all the heat before it reaches you." Winter paused, trowel in hand, mortar dripping. He looked at Hendricks with those pale blue eyes that attract wounded grizzlies through blizzards. "Stone that takes heat," he said slowly in his thick accent, "also gives heat. For a long time after fire dies." Hendricks laughed. "That's backwards thinking, Jacob. Fire goes out, you get cold. That's how it works." But Winter understood something about thermal conductivity and radiant heat that the valley's builders had never considered. Sandstone has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.7 to 0.9 kilojoules per kilogram per degree Celsius. Those 4,000 pounds of stone, properly heated, could store and slowly release an enormous amount of thermal energy. The angled firebox ensured maximum flame contact with the rear thermal mass. The extended side walls would radiate heat outward long after the last log burned down to coals. It wasn't backwards. It was physics that Scandinavian farmers had proven over centuries in climates where survival depended on making every piece of firewood count. By late November, Winter had completed the hearth. The valley's judgment was unanimous. Impressive stonework, completely impractical design. When winter came, they said he'd learn his mistake. They had no idea that winter would teach them instead. What Jacob Winter had built wasn't just a hearth. It was a thermal battery. The principle was simple, but its application required understanding that most frontier builders lacked. Standard fireplaces operated on convective heating. Burn hot, heat the air, keep feeding wood. The moment the fire died down, the warmth vanished. Cabins would plunge from tolerably warm to dangerously cold within 2 hours of the last log burning out. Winter's design prioritized radiant heat storage over immediate air heating. The physics worked like this. When fire burns against stone, thermal energy transfers through conduction into the rock's molecular structure. The denser and more thermally massive the stone, the more heat it absorbs. But here's what the valley's masons missed. That stored heat doesn't disappear. It radiates back out steadily over many hours, sometimes days, depending on the mass involved. Winter's 4,000 pounds of carefully selected sandstone and granite provided what engineers would later call thermal flywheel effect. The deeply angled firebox, 43 degrees instead of the standard 90-degree vertical, meant that flames licked directly against the rear stone wall, maximizing contact time and heat transfer. A conventional vertical firebox sends most heat straight up the chimney. Winter's design captured it. The 18-inch lateral extension into the cabin walls served another purpose, increasing radiating surface area. While a standard hearth might present 12 square feet of heated stone to the living space, Winter's U-shaped configuration exposed nearly 32 square feet. More surface area meant more radiant heat transfer into the cabin, even when the fire reduced to embers. He'd also calculated the chimney offset deliberately. Instead of running straight up from the firebox, it angled back through an additional 2 feet of stone mass before exiting through the roof. This baffle effect captured heat that would otherwise escape, while still maintaining sufficient draft to prevent smoke backup. The seemingly wrong chimney placement was actually thermodynamic optimization. Samuel Bradley, watching the construction, had called it Highland ignorance, a dismissive reference to Winter's Norwegian origins. But Norway's stone and sod structures had kept families alive through Arctic conditions for 1,000 years. The real ignorance was assuming that American frontier methods, developed in milder climates with abundant timber, represented the pinnacle of heating efficiency. By early December, Winter was burning half the wood his neighbors required to maintain cabin temperature. His fire never roared, it didn't need to. A modest burn for 4 to 5 hours in the evening would heat the stone mass to the point where it radiated comfortable warmth until the following afternoon. His neighbors burned through the night and still woke to frost forming on the insides of their windows. "He's just running his cabin colder," Bradley insisted, toughing it out like an old miser. But Winter's wife, Ingrid, told a different story to the settlement's women. "Our cabin holds 68 degrees through the night," she said. "Jacob builds one fire at sunset. By morning, the stones are still warm to touch." The women believed her. The men called it exaggeration. Then January arrived, and with it came cold that would settle the argument permanently. January 9th, 1892, the barometer began falling. Veteran trappers recognized the signs. Crystalline stillness in the air, a greenish tint to the northern horizon at dusk, ravens flying south in massive flocks. The animals knew. Within 48 hours, a polar outbreak, what modern meteorologists would classify as an extreme Arctic intrusion, descended on Montana territory. January 11th. The temperature dropped to 14 below zero. Cabins throughout Slate Creek Valley burned wood around the clock. Families slept in shifts, someone always awake to feed the fires. Letting the flames die meant risking death. January 12th, 3 a.m., minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas Hendricks, the young trapper who'd mocked Vinter's design, was burning through a cord of wood every 36 hours. His cabin hovered around 52 degrees inside despite constant feeding of the fire. His children slept in their coats. Samuel Bradley's situation was worse. His expertly built standard hearth, constructed with proper vertical firebox and straight chimney draw, required stoking every 90 minutes to maintain livable temperature. By the second night of extreme cold, he burned through 4 days' worth of his winter wood supply, and still the temperature fell. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next defied everything the settlement thought they knew about heating. Drop a comment with where you're watching from, and let's continue. January 14th, minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold had settled in like a physical presence. Metal tools left outside became brittle enough to shatter. Spit froze before hitting the ground. The snow compressed into a surface so hard that grown men could walk on top of it without breaking through. This was the test. This was the crucible that would prove or disprove everything. Jacob Vinter's routine hadn't changed. Each evening, around 5 p.m., he built a fire. Not a massive conflagration, a modest, controlled burn using roughly 18 to 20 pounds of split pine and fir. He'd arranged the logs at an angle, matching the pitch of his firebox, ensuring maximum contact with the rear stone wall. The fire would burn steadily for 4 to 5 hours, the flames painting the angled sandstone in shades of orange and gold. By 10 p.m., he let it burn down to coals. Then he'd go to sleep. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. "He's going to freeze to death," Bradley told his wife, genuinely concerned. "That old fool's going to be found frozen solid in his bed." But Jacob Vinter understood something they didn't. His hearth was still working while he slept. Those 4,000 pounds of sandstone and granite had absorbed hours of direct flame contact. The thermal mass had climbed to temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit in the core stones. And now, through the long frozen night, that stored heat radiated steadily outward into the cabin space. At 2 a.m., with outside temperature at 32 below zero, Vinter's cabin maintained 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The massive stone structure glowed with barely visible infrared radiation, releasing stored thermal energy at a rate that exactly matched the cabin's heat loss to the brutal cold outside. Bradley's cabin, meanwhile, had dropped to 47 degrees, despite a fire still burning in his conventional hearth. Hendricks was awake, splitting more wood by lantern light, his family huddled near the flames. The deadly cold continued for 22 days. By January 18th, the settlement's wood supplies had become critical. Samuel Bradley had burned through 38% of his winter stockpile in just 9 days. At this rate, he'd run out by mid-February, with 2 months of winter still ahead. Other families faced similar mathematics. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was potentially lethal. Thomas Hendricks made the first admission. On the morning of January 19th, he walked across the frozen creek to Vinter's cabin, swallowing his pride. He needed to know how the old Norwegian was surviving. What he found shocked him. Vinter's woodpile had barely diminished. The old hunter was burning approximately 20 pounds of wood per day, roughly 1/3 the amount Hendricks was consuming. Yet when Hendricks stepped inside the cabin, the warmth hit him like a physical force. "What's the temperature in here?" Hendricks asked, staring at the hearth where no fire currently burned. It was 9 a.m. The last flames had died 8 hours earlier. Ingrid Vinter consulted the mercury thermometer hanging on the far wall. 66 degrees, she replied. Hendricks felt the stone structure. It radiated heat like a living thing. The surface temperature of the sandstone registered roughly 140 degrees Fahrenheit, still hot to touch 9 hours after the fire had gone out. "Ow," was all Hendricks could manage. Vinter gestured to the massive thermal battery he'd constructed. "The stone remembers the fire," he said simply, "holds the heat, gives it back slow." Word spread quickly. By January 21st, Samuel Bradley had conducted his own investigation. He brought a notebook, determined to document the impossible efficiency he was witnessing. His measurements told an extraordinary story. Vinter's system, wood consumption, 18 to 22 pounds per 24-hour period fire duration, 4 to 5 hours per day cabin temperature. During extreme cold 64 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit maintained heat retention. Stone mass remained warm to touch 18 to 20 hours after fire extinguished estimated thermal mass. 4,000 plus lbs of sandstone and granite radiant surface area. Approximately 32 square feet Bradley's conventional hearth. Wood consumption, 62 to 68 pounds per 24-hour period fire duration. 18 to 20 hours per day. Nearly constant burning. Cabin temperature. During extreme cold 51 to 56 degrees Fahrenheit maintained heat retention. Negligible after fire reduction estimated thermal mass. 1,200 pounds of mixed stone radiant surface area. Approximately 12 square feet. The efficiency difference was staggering. Winter was burning roughly one-third the wood while maintaining 12 to 14 degrees higher cabin temperature. The thermal mass was releasing stored heat at an average rate that matched the cabin's heat loss through walls and roof, creating thermal equilibrium that lasted through the night and well into the following day. Bradley sat at his kitchen table that evening, studying his notes by firelight. The numbers didn't lie. Winter's crazy design was outperforming conventional frontier hearths by a margin that defied what Bradley thought possible. But the truly humbling realization came from the physics. There was nothing magical about Winter's hearth. It was pure thermodynamics. Specific heat capacity, thermal mass, radiant heat transfer, principles that had been understood and applied in Scandinavia for centuries while American builders stubbornly clung to methods that prioritized immediate heat over sustained warmth. On January 23rd, the temperature finally began to rise. The deadly cold had lasted 22 days, long enough to prove beyond any doubt that Jacob Winter had built something remarkable, and more importantly, something reproducible. By late January, 3 families had already begun planning to rebuild their hearths using Winter's principles. The old hunter's foolish design had become the valley's most sought-after construction knowledge. The question now wasn't whether it worked. The question was, how quickly could they adopt it before next winter arrived? February 1892. The transformation of Slate Creek Valley had begun. Samuel Bradley, the mason who'd called Winter's design Highland ignorance, became its first and most vocal convert. On February 3rd, he began dismantling his own hearth, the same structure he'd built with 30 years of experience and absolute confidence. His neighbors watched in amazement as Bradley, pride swallowed, asked Jacob Winter to supervise the reconstruction. "I was wrong," Bradley admitted publicly at the settlement's general store. "Dead wrong. That man understands stone and heat better than anyone I've ever met." The collaboration between Bradley and Winter produced something remarkable, a documented blueprint of the thermal mass hearth design. Bradley's masonry expertise, combined with Winter's thermodynamic knowledge, created a replicable system. They measured every angle, recorded every specification, calculated stone requirements based on cabin size. The key principles they documented: firebox angle, 42 to 45 degrees for vertical. Steeper angles improved flame contact with rear thermal mass, but required careful chimney design to maintain draft. Stone selection: dense river rock, sandstone, and granite prioritized. Minimum 3,800 pounds for a standard 16 by 20 foot cabin. Stone to cabin size ratio calculated at roughly 240 pounds per 100 square feet of living space. Lateral extension: 18 inches minimum into sidewalls, creating U-shaped heat radiator. Surface area optimization critical. Every square foot of exposed heated stone contributed to radiant warmth. Chimney configuration: offset design with internal baffle to capture escaping heat. The chimney path through stone mass added approximately 8 to 12 hours of additional heat retention. Firebox position: lower placement, 8 to 10 inches above floor level, allowed heated air to rise naturally while maximizing stone mass above fire level. By March 1892, for cabins in Slate Creek Valley had rebuilt their hearths following Winter's principles. Thomas Hendricks completed his in late February, working through lingering cold to finish before spring. His wife reported cabin temperatures holding steady at 65 degrees overnight with a single evening fire, a dramatic improvement over their previous system that required constant feeding. But the real test would come the following winter. November 1892 through February 1893 brought another brutal Montana season, though not quite as severe as the previous year. The thermal mass hearths performed exactly as predicted. Families using Vinters' design burned an average of 43% less within those still operating conventional fireplaces. The temperature differential remained consistent. Thermal mass cabins maintained 8 to 14 degrees warmer than standard designs, while requiring 60 to 70% less fuel. The economic impact was substantial. In an environment where every cord of wood required hours of dangerous labor, felling trees in sub-zero conditions, hauling through snow, splitting frozen logs, a 43% reduction in fuel consumption translated to save lives and preserve resources. Men could spend less time gathering firewood and more time hunting, trapping, and maintaining their homesteads. Word spread beyond Slate Creek Valley. By late 1893, 17 cabins within a 50-mile radius had incorporated Vinters' thermal mass design. Traveling trappers and traders carried the knowledge further. A homesteader from Wyoming Territory visited specifically to study the system, taking detailed notes to bring back to his settlement. Samuel Bradley, once the design's harshest critic, became its most effective advocate. He built 6 thermal mass hearths for other families between 1892 and 1894, refining the technique with each construction. He developed innovations of his own. A clever ash pit system that allowed hot coals to be preserved overnight, a stone shelf configuration that improved radiant distribution. But Bradley never forgot to credit the source. "Every stone I lay in these hearths," he told clients, "I lay in honor of what Jacob Vinter taught me." He understood what I was too proud to see, that wisdom doesn't care about your age or your accent or where you learned your trade. It only cares whether you're willing to learn. Jacob Vinter himself remained characteristically modest about the recognition. When visitors came to study his hearth, he'd explain the principles patiently, demonstrate the construction technique, then return to his trapping. He never charged for the knowledge. "My grandfather taught me free," he'd say. "I teach you free. You teach the next man free." That's how good things spread. By 1895, the thermal mass hearth had become standard construction in the region. New cabins were built with the system from the beginning. The old conventional designs were seen as wasteful relics of ignorance, though only a few years earlier, they'd been considered the only proper way to build. The transformation was complete. What the valley had mocked as madness had become accepted wisdom. And Jacob Vinter, the crazy old Norwegian hunter, had proven that sometimes the most advanced engineering looks primitive to those who don't understand it. Jacob Vinter died in his sleep in April 1899 at the age of 81. His thermal mass hearth, still functioning perfectly, had kept him warm through 7 Montana winters after the deadly cold of 1892 proved its worth. The legacy he left wasn't just a heating system. It was a lesson in humility. The frontier had always celebrated innovation, but it had often confused innovation with novelty. Americans prided themselves on improving old methods, discarding what they saw as outdated European or indigenous practices. The assumption was simple: newer equals better, and traditional equals primitive. Vinter's hearth shattered that assumption. His design wasn't new. It was ancient, refined over centuries and climates where thermal efficiency meant the difference between survival and death. Norwegian farmhouses, Russian pechkas, Korean ondal systems, Finnish masonry stoves. Cultures across the Northern Hemisphere had independently developed thermal mass heating because the physics demanded it. What made Vinter's contribution remarkable wasn't invention. It was translation. He'd taken knowledge proven in one harsh environment and applied it to another, demonstrating that fundamental thermodynamic principles operate the same way regardless of geography or culture. The thermal mass hearth taught Slate Creek Valley something uncomfortable. Their dismissal of Vinter's crazy design revealed not his ignorance, but theirs. They'd assumed their frontier methods represented peak engineering because they'd never questioned whether their assumptions were correct. They confused familiarity with superiority. Samuel Bradley understood this in his later years. In 1903, now in his 60s, he wrote a short manuscript about the experience, never published, but preserved by his family. One passage stands out. We called Jacob Vinner foolish because his hearth looked wrong to our eyes. We never asked whether our eyes might be inadequately trained. We assumed that because we built many fireplaces, we knew all there was to know about building fireplaces. Jacob proved that expertise without curiosity is just repeated ignorance with confidence. The lesson extends beyond heating systems. How many other traditional practices, agricultural techniques, food preservation methods, construction principles, medicinal knowledge, have been dismissed as primitive simply because they didn't match modern expectations? How much accumulated wisdom has been lost because cultures assumed their current methods couldn't be improved by looking backward? Vinter's hearth proved that engineering sophistication isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's hidden in what appears simple. A pile of stones arranged at an angle. A chimney that seems wrongly placed. Mass where efficiency-minded builders saw waste. The modern application remains relevant. Today's off-grid builders and homesteaders rediscover these principles regularly, often calling them innovations when they're actually rediscoveries. High-mass rocket stoves, thermal battery walls, masonry heaters, all operate on the same physics Jacob Vinner understood in 1891. The technology hasn't changed. Stone still has the same specific heat capacity. Radiant heat still transfers the same way. What changes is whether we're humble enough to learn from those who solved these problems before us. Before you go, do me one final favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. If this story taught you something about traditional wisdom and engineering, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Jacob Vinner's hearth stood in that Montana cabin until 1967, when the structure was finally abandoned. 76 years of service. 3 generations of warmth from a design that was called crazy until winter proved it brilliant. It had demonstrated something profound, that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. That the best engineering sometimes comes not from discarding old methods, but from understanding why they worked. And that wisdom, like heat stored in stone, can sustain us long after its source has gone cold. The old Norwegian hunter never sought fame. He just wanted to stay warm and help his neighbors survive. In doing so, he left a legacy more enduring than any monument. Proof that listening to those we're tempted to dismiss might teach us more than insisting we already know everything worth knowing. His lesson still radiates outward, like heat from 4,000 pounds of carefully chosen stone, warming those wise enough to learn from it.